The Arizona heat pressed down like molten steel as Commander Isabella Riley stepped onto the scorching tarmac at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. Her combat-tested flight boots crunched against asphalt that had been baked white by relentless desert, sun, and decades of jet exhaust. She wore a sun-bleached sage flight suit, zipped tight despite the crushing temperature, her shoulder-length auburn hair secured in a regulation bun that caught the desert wind like copper wire. In her left hand, she gripped a battle-scarred leather flight bag that had survived more combat zones than most career officers. In her right, a hand-annotated flight card, the old-school paper kind that digital generation pilots had abandoned for tablet computers years ago. The card showed slight warping from the dampness of her palm, betraying nerves she'd trained herself never to acknowledge. But what nobody knew was that this mission would either vindicate 20 years of being overlooked or end her career in spectacular failure. The flight line sprawled before her like a monument to American air supremacy. Pristine F-22 Raptors gleamed under mercury vapor lights, their stealth coating and razor-sharp angles designed to intimidate visiting international delegations. Massive C-5 Galaxy transports sat in parade formation, their titanium hulls buffed to mirror brilliance for the cameras that followed high-ranking officials. Her aircraft squatted alone at the forgotten corner of the strip, a scarred A-10. Thunderbolt that looked like a refugee from a different war. The olive-drab paint had weathered and chipped in patches, exposing bare aluminum underneath like battle scars that told stories no one bothered to read, while other aircraft basked in the attention of specialized maintenance crews and technical teams. Hers sat in deliberate isolation. "You lost, lady?" called a crew chief without warmth, peering at her through grease-stained safety glasses. His tone carried the casual contempt reserved for those who obviously didn't belong in the same airspace as the real warriors. Another voice drifted from near a refueling truck. "Maybe she's here to bring sandwiches to the actual pilots?" The comment triggered scattered chuckles from nearby ground personnel, who barely lifted their eyes from their equipment checks. Isabella offered no reaction. She maintained her measured pace toward the operations tent, her expression revealing nothing. At the mission briefing desk, a junior flight officer accepted her annotated card without making eye contact. One glance at the handwritten modifications, and his face twisted into barely disguised disdain. "You're not on today's manifest," he stated flatly, allowing the card to flutter onto the desk as he pivoted to grab another clipboard. Behind her, the mockery erupted again, sharp and dismissive. She remained silent. She simply retraced her steps across the tarmac past alternating pools of shadow and blazing sunlight and stopped beside her aircraft. No one pursued her. No one cared enough to pursue her. What they didn't realize was that she'd been preparing for this exact moment for 3 years, ever since the incident that had nearly destroyed her career. Inside the mobile command center, tension thickened the air like cordite smoke. A whiteboard displayed 4 bold red X's, each marking a failed mission attempt. Below them, a smaller entry read, "Operation Desert Rescue. Critical." The atmosphere was heavy with humidity from perspiration, electronic heat, and the kind of frustration that erupted when pride collided with repeated failure. Personnel moved between workstations with brittle, aggressive energy. Radio chatter crackled constantly, reporting another aborted rescue attempt in hostile territory. 4 elite squadrons had attempted the dangerous extraction mission. 4 had returned with tales of impossible conditions and equipment malfunctions. Isabella Riley stood just inside the tent entrance, unnoticed for nearly 2 full minutes until a staff sergeant glanced up from his communications console. "If you're here for the casualty notification briefing, that's over at Operations 3, he said, gesturing toward another tent that sagged under the weight of bureaucratic failure. "I'm here to fly," she replied quietly. He blinked in confusion. "Fly what?" "My aircraft, the A-10. Colonel Marcus Steele's voice sliced through the humid air like a blade. He was a man accustomed to absolute obedience, his uniform crisp despite the oppressive heat, his bearing radiating the kind of authority that crushed dissent before it could form. "You're not on the current manifest. You're not cleared for active rescue operations. That aircraft hasn't been rated for mountain terrain extraction since the last safety reclassification." Isabella extended a flight sheet with updated configuration details. Steele barely acknowledged it. "We've got qualified teams in the air. Already, 4 failures don't mean we throw protocols out the window and let museum pieces take over." Behind her, a younger pilot in an immaculate flight suit laughed. His custom squadron patch gleamed over his breast pocket, and his confidence radiated the arrogance of someone who'd never experienced genuine failure. "What's next?" he called out. "Bring out the Vietnam-era birds? Nostalgia with wings reporting for duty." More laughter followed, nervous, relieved chuckling that gave the room something to focus on instead of confronting their mounting failures. But Isabella had spent the last 3 years studying the mountain terrain maps, memorizing wind patterns and calculating approach vectors that the computer systems couldn't process. She knew something they didn't. In that moment, Isabella realized something that would fuel everything that followed. They weren't just dismissing her capabilities. They were terrified of what it might mean if the overlooked woman with the obsolete aircraft succeeded where their elite squadrons had failed. She placed the flight sheet on the edge of a folding table and walked out of the tent. Outside, storm. Clouds gathered on the eastern horizon, dark, menacing, and unforgiving. Time was running out for the soldiers who needed extraction, but Isabella Riley had spent her entire career being underestimated. Today, that would finally become her greatest weapon. The storm front loomed closer as Isabella sat on the wing of her A-10, observing the chaos unfolding around her. The base hummed with desperate energy as officers scrambled to find solutions to their impossible mission. 4 elite flight teams had returned with reports of devastating weather conditions, equipment failures, and terrain too treacherous for standard extraction procedures. Her leather-bound flight manual lay open across her lap, its pages yellowed and dog-eared from decades of use. In the margins, her initials IR appeared beside hand-drawn trajectory calculations and altitude compensation equations, formulas she'd developed through years of flying missions others deemed impossible. The manual contained a secret that could change everything. Modifications she'd discovered during her 3 years of unofficial exile, techniques that standard flight computers couldn't process. The fuselage around her bore the faded outline of an old squadron emblem, and a series of rivets along the gun housing had been polished so smooth they felt like silk under her fingertips. This aircraft wasn't just her assignment, it was her partner in a career spent proving that experience could triumph over technology. Across the tarmac, Colonel Steele gestured aggressively at a topographical map while raising his voice to a cluster of officers. "We don't have authorization to wait for miracles. Either we execute this mission in the next 60 minutes, or we issue a withdrawal order and abandon the extraction zone." A communications technician glanced toward Isabella, then quickly averted his gaze. No one wanted to acknowledge the obvious solution sitting 30 yards from their heated discussions. Lieutenant Cameron Brooks, barely old enough to vote, passed by her aircraft carrying a stack of digital tablets. He noticed her weathered flight guide and smirked. "Where'd you excavate that antique?" "They uploaded the updated version to the mission system years ago." His tone carried the condescension of someone who'd learned everything from simulators and nothing from actual combat experience. Isabella turned a page and continued reading. Her silence seemed to irritate him more than any response could have. "Good luck finding anything useful in that paper museum piece," he added with a short laugh before walking away. What he didn't know was that the antique manual contained classified modifications that had been removed from the digital versions, techniques that could make the impossible mission possible. The wind intensified, creating dust devils near the supply containers. 2 medics walked past carrying empty medical kits, their faces grim and silent. They'd just returned from the forward command post, the same post waiting desperately for the extraction that no one could accomplish. A voice crackled over the emergency frequency, strained and urgent. "Alpha Base, this is Mountain Team 7. We've got injured personnel requiring immediate evacuation. Visibility dropping fast. Any update on extraction status would be appreciated." The transmission ended in static. No one responded because no one had positive news to share. Inside the operations trailer, the discussion had devolved into frustrated circles. Flight officers recycled the same failed strategies, their voices taking on the hollow ring of people who'd exhausted all viable options. "We can't authorize." "Another attempt without proper clearance," one officer insisted. "The only available airframe is—" He stopped short, the unfinished sentence hanging in the air like an accusation. They all knew, they all saw her sitting there. But admitting they needed the woman they'd dismissed meant acknowledging their own inadequacy. Isabella opened to a specific page in her manual, one that contained hand-drawn diagrams of mountain approach angles that defied standard aviation protocol. These were techniques she'd developed in secret, tested in unauthorized training flights during her 3 years of professional exile. Outside, Isabella stood and closed her manual. Her thumb lingered on her initials for a moment. A small gesture that contained decades of missions flown in the shadows of more celebrated pilots. She slid the manual into her pack and walked up to her aircraft. The sun was lower now, painting the distant peaks in shades of crimson and gold. She reached up and gripped the edge of the cockpit, testing a harness connection with a slow, methodical pull. Everything was solid, ready, waiting. She climbed into her aircraft, her figure disappearing into the shadow of the cockpit. Behind her, the runway lights flickered on as the stormline edged closer. The only sound that followed was the whisper of wind over metal as Isabella began her pre-flight sequence alone. No one called out to stop her. No one even noticed she'd begun preparing for the mission they claimed was impossible. But in 15 minutes, when her engines roared to life without authorization, they'd finally understand what they'd been overlooking all along. The woman who never demanded respect was about to earn it the hard way by succeeding where everyone else had failed, using techniques that officially didn't exist. The emergency radio crackled again. "Alpha Base, this is Mountain Team 7. Storm's closing in fast. If anyone's coming, now would be good." Isabella Riley was coming. She just hadn't asked permission first. The cockpit of the A-10 felt like a fortress in the growing darkness, compact, purposeful, and sacred in its mission. Isabella moved through her preparations with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned that success lived in the details everyone else ignored. Her hands moved across switches and controls with the fluid grace of a concert pianist playing a familiar composition, each adjustment made by feel rather than checklist. The weapon systems had been removed and replaced with specialized rescue equipment, a winch system, emergency medical supplies, and communication gear that wasn't standard issue. These modifications had taken her 3 years to design and install, working in secret during off-duty hours when the maintenance bays were empty. What made her approach different wasn't just experience. It was a revolutionary technique she'd discovered that used the A-10's unique characteristics in ways the aircraft designers never intended. Outside, the base stirred with increasing urgency. Radio chatter hissed through the communications systems. Status lights clicked from amber to red across the flight line. The fourth weather alert of the evening chimed from the control tower, warning of deteriorating conditions in the target zone. In the command tent, officers huddled in tight circles of indecision. Maps were spread and respread across folding tables. The same failed rescue plans were discussed and discarded for the 5th time in 2 hours. A final, desperate transmission had just arrived from the mountain team, urgent, strained, carrying the weight of lives hanging in the balance. The zone still needed immediate extraction. No airframes were officially cleared. No crew was officially willing to risk their careers on an unauthorized mission. Isabella didn't wait for official clearance. Her boots settled firmly on the rudder pedals as she walked through the final pre-flight checks. Her hair was secured tight against the growing wind, sleeves rolled back to her elbows in preparation for work that demanded complete focus. The flight card sat beside the throttle control, unsigned and unstamped by the bureaucracy that had tried to erase her, but annotated with the care of someone who understood that small details determined life-and-death outcomes. She placed it under the edge of the instrument panel, a quiet acknowledgement of the system that had overlooked her value. Her fingers found the engine start sequence with practiced ease, but this time was different. Hidden in her flight suit pocket was a small device, a frequency scanner that would allow her to monitor enemy communications during the rescue attempt. This edge might be the difference between success and catastrophe. The A-10's engines, turned over with a thunderous roar, twin turbofans screaming to life in a symphony of controlled power that rippled across the flight line like mechanical lightning. The ground around her aircraft shuddered with thrust and heat. Nearby technicians turned toward the unexpected sound, their conversations stopping mid-sentence. One reached for his radio, hesitated as he processed what he was witnessing, then slowly lowered it without making the call. No one moved to stop her. The moment had arrived when action would speak louder than authority, when results would matter more than regulations. Inside the command center, a controller looked up sharply from his console. Is she actually moving that aircraft? The young officer beside him froze, his training manual open to procedures that had never covered this situation. She doesn't have clearance. That aircraft isn't on the authorized roster for tonight's operations. Call it in, the controller ordered, but his voice lacked conviction. They all knew what the call would accomplish. Nothing. The woman who'd been dismissed all day was now taking action while they continued to analyze and debate. Isabella began taxiing forward, her aircraft moving with the deliberate pace of someone who'd made peace with the consequences of doing what needed to be done. But unknown to everyone watching, she was also testing a modification to her aircraft's ground handling system, one that would prove crucial for the mountain landing she was planning. The tower erupted in radio chatter. Unscheduled movement on runway Alpha 3. Advise immediate shutdown. You do not have clearance for takeoff. No response from the A-10's radio. A second voice, sharper and more frustrated, cut through the frequency. A-10 on active taxiway. Stand down immediately or face court-martial proceedings. This is a direct order. Still nothing. The compact aircraft continued its deliberate turn onto the active runway, unstoppable as a force of nature. A junior officer sprinted toward the aircraft, then stopped, caught in the jet wash of its passing. Isabella didn't glance down from her cockpit. Her attention was focused entirely forward, on the mission, the storm, and the soldiers who were counting on someone to break through when breaking through seemed impossible. Inside the cockpit, switches flipped under her fingers with the fluid grace of someone executing a plan 3 years in the making. Her face remained calm, but her eyes held the focused intensity of someone about to attempt something that had never been tried before. She read wind direction from the tower indicators and ignored the forecasted turbulence warnings scrolling across her weather display. There was no co-pilot to confirm her decisions, no navigator to double-check her calculations. Just her. Modified equipment, her forbidden techniques, and the storm-dark sky waiting beyond the runway. One final transmission buzzed through her headset. You are not cleared for takeoff. Do you copy? Isabella reached for the communication switch, her hand hovering over it for a moment that contained entire conversations about duty, protocol, and the difference between following orders and saving lives. Then she let her hand fall to the throttle instead. The A-10 surged down the runway like a predator unleashed from captivity. But this wasn't just any takeoff. Isabella was executing a short-field technique she'd perfected in secret, one that would allow her to land in impossible terrain that had defeated 4 previous rescue attempts. The sound built from a mechanical growl into thunder wrapped in titanium, echoing off the hangars and rattling windows across the base. Inside the cockpit, Isabella felt every bolt and rivet trembling with strain as the aircraft approached takeoff speed. The rugged airframe vibrated in ways that would terrify younger pilots, but Isabella recognized each tremor as a familiar conversation between pilot and machine. The nose wheel lifted first, followed by the main landing gear in a moment that felt like breaking free from gravity itself. She pulled back gently on the stick, coaxing rather than commanding the aircraft into the air. The A-10 rose low over the base, hugging the desert floor like a ghost navigating by instinct rather than instruments. As she banked toward the mountains, Isabella activated the frequency scanner hidden in her pocket. Immediately, enemy radio chatter filled her headset, confirming her worst fears. The rescue zone was under active surveillance, and the previous 4 rescue attempts had been anticipated and countered. The temperature in the cockpit dropped as she gained altitude. Isabella leveled out at 12,000 feet, checked her heading against the compass, and gave one last glance to the annotated flight card. Then she slid it into her jacket pocket, a small act of defiance that felt larger than the unauthorized takeoff itself. The radio channels had gone silent. No more desperate orders crackling through her headset, no more threats of legal action, just the steady hum of engines and the whisper of wind over aluminum skin. Below her, the base stood frozen in a moment of collective realization. The woman they'd dismissed had taken action while they'd continued to debate. But none of them knew about the secret equipment modifications or the revolutionary rescue technique she was about to attempt, one that could either save the trapped soldiers or end her career forever. On the ground, officers remained frozen. At their consoles, the aircraft was gone, carrying with it their last hope for mission success and their assumptions about who deserved to be taken seriously. For the first time all day, no one had anything left to say. The mountains rose ahead like the jagged teeth of some ancient beast, their peaks shrouded in storm clouds and their valleys hidden in darkness that had swallowed 4 previous rescue attempts. Isabella flew in low, skimming just above the tree line where radar coverage was minimal and where she could feel the terrain's influence on her aircraft. But she wasn't flying blind. The frequency scanner crackled with enemy communications, giving her real-time intelligence that the previous rescue attempts had lacked. She could hear their positions, their patrol schedules, their growing confusion. About the single aircraft approaching from an unexpected vector. There were no navigation beacons guiding her approach, no GPS coordinates uploaded to her flight system, no radioed altitude checks from ground controllers. Just the landscape itself and her memory of its contours. But more importantly, there was the secret technique she'd spent 3 years perfecting, using the A-10's unique, slow-flight characteristics to navigate terrain that was impossible for faster aircraft. She adjusted the control surfaces manually, feeling the stick resist her input as mountain winds hit the aircraft like invisible hammers. The right wing dipped suddenly as a downdraft caught her, but she corrected with a combination of rudder and throttle that kept the A-10 stable despite the air's attempt to throw her against the canyon walls. The enemy radio chatter intensified. They'd detected her approach but couldn't understand how a single aircraft was penetrating airspace where their surface-to-air missiles had turned back 4 previous rescue attempts. Her approach angle was too low, too slow, defying their targeting. Parameters. The cockpit shuddered under the strain of flight at the edge of the aircraft's capabilities. One loose panel above her left shoulder rattled with a sharp, metallic whine that spoke of age and stress, but also of an aircraft that had survived worse conditions than this. Darkness was falling fast. Mountain shadows created a maze of black. Valleys where her rescue target waited, hidden somewhere beyond the tree line in terrain too rough for helicopters and too dangerous for conventional aircraft. She reached for the stopwatch clipped to her flight harness, its crystal face cracked from years of use but still functional, still reliable when digital systems might fail. Isabella activated a second hidden modification: infrared sensors. She'd installed to see through the darkness and locate heat signatures from the stranded soldiers. The display showed multiple enemy positions surrounding the rescue zone, confirming why 4 previous attempts had failed. She exhaled slowly and scanned the ridgeline ahead. The wind shifted again, and a tremor rolled through the aircraft. Not dramatic, just a sudden pocket of air gone missing beneath her left wing. She compensated with the kind of micro-adjustments that separated experienced pilots from skilled ones, keeping her aircraft stable in conditions that had forced others to abandon their missions. Down below, hidden somewhere beyond the tree line, was the improvised landing zone, a flattened area marked by chemical glow sticks barely wide enough for a successful landing. No electronic guidance system could guide her to it. No confirmation beacon would tell her when she'd found it. Just a margin of error the size of a basketball court and the kind of precision that came from flying by instinct rather than instruments. The enemy radio chatter revealed their growing panic. Her approach was so unconventional that their defensive positions were all facing the wrong direction. She was using terrain features to mask her approach in ways their tactical planning hadn't anticipated. She keyed the landing gear extension. The mechanism caught once before unlocking with a mechanical groan that she felt through the aircraft's frame. Behind her, the gear extended into the slipstream, transforming her from a flying machine into a landing craft balanced on the knife's edge between success and catastrophe. The rescue zone materialized below her, barely visible heat. Signatures from the stranded soldiers, arranged in a defensive perimeter around casualties who couldn't be moved without medical evacuation. She could see muzzle flashes from enemy positions that had pinned down the rescue team for 6 hours. Isabella began counting backward from 10, her eyes locked on the terrain below, watching for the distinctive rock formation that marked her landing reference point. She adjusted her speed slightly, nose up 2 degrees, left wing dip to compensate for wind drift. 9. She touched the edge of her cracked stopwatch, feeling its familiar weight against her flight suit. 8. The mountain peaks pressed, close on both sides as Isabella entered the final phase of her approach. 7. She placed her right hand on the communication controls, ready to signal the ground team. 6. The enemy radio chatter exploded with confusion. They could hear her engines but couldn't locate her position. Her approach angle was impossible according to their tactical assessments. 5. She pulled power back to minimum sustainable flight speed using the A-10's unique ability to fly slower than any other jet aircraft. 4. The landing zone appeared. In her windscreen, a small clearing surrounded by trees, barely long enough for the kind of landing she was about to attempt. 3. She could see the heat signatures of wounded soldiers being prepared for evacuation by their teammates. 2. This was the moment of truth. The revolutionary technique she'd perfected in secret was about to be tested under combat conditions. If it failed, she wouldn't survive to face court-martial proceedings. 1. The wheels touched down hard on rough terrain that would have destroyed. A conventional aircraft, but the A-10 was built for this, designed to operate from damaged runways and improvised airfields. The landing gear absorbed the impact as she applied maximum braking, stopping in a distance that seemed impossible. For a jet aircraft, as the engines spooled down, Isabella activated her final secret weapon, a jamming device that would block enemy communications for exactly 12 minutes. Enough time to load the casualties and escape before the enemy could coordinate a counterattack. The cargo door opened, and wounded soldiers were carried aboard by their teammates with the desperate efficiency of people who'd been waiting to die until someone finally broke through. Isabella kept the engines running, one hand on the throttles, ready for immediate takeoff. From the cockpit, she could see enemy positions converging on her location, but her jamming device had created confusion in their ranks. They were operating without coordination, giving her the window she needed. The last wounded soldier was loaded. The cargo door sealed. Isabella pushed the throttles forward and began her takeoff roll on terrain that no training manual said was possible for jet aircraft operations. The A-10 lifted off from the mountain clearing like a phoenix rising from impossible circumstances. She'd succeeded where 4 elite rescue teams had failed, using techniques that officially didn't exist and equipment modifications that would probably end her career. She climbed steeply away from the mountains, feeling the aircraft respond. With the grudging power of a machine that had been asked for one more impossible effort. Behind her, the enemy positions erupted in frustrated gunfire aimed at an aircraft that was already beyond their reach. The wounded soldiers would live. The mission was complete. And Isabella Riley had just proven that being underestimated could be the greatest tactical advantage of all. Below her, the mountain peaks fell away into darkness. Above her, stars appeared as she climbed above the weather system, revealing a night sky that had been hidden by storm clouds. She touched the edge of the cockpit panel where the metal had been worn smooth by countless hands, a small gesture that connected her to every pilot who'd ever flown into impossible places and found a way to bring everyone home. For a moment, she allowed herself a small smile. She'd just executed the most unconventional rescue mission in military history, and officially, it had never happened. Then she pulled back on the controls, leveled out at cruising altitude, and began the flight home. Behind her, wounded soldiers received medical treatment in the cargo bay. Ahead of her waited a base full of people who would finally understand what they'd been overlooking all along. The woman who never demanded respect had just earned it in the most definitive way possible, by succeeding when success seemed impossible, using methods that challenged everything they thought they knew about aviation and combat rescue operations. The first radio transmission came through clear and urgent, a medic's voice speaking from the mountain rescue zone with the professional calm of someone who'd learned not to get excited about miracles until they were confirmed. Alpha Base, this is Mountain Team 7. All personnel successfully extracted. Casualties are stable and receiving medical treatment. Whoever made that pickup run just saved 6 lives. There was a long pause before the next transmission, as if everyone listening needed time to process that the impossible mission had actually succeeded. Another voice confirmed from a different frequency, "Mountain Team 7, this is Overwatch Command. We monitored the entire extraction, textbook precision under impossible conditions. Outstanding work by whoever executed that operation." The praise hung in the radio frequency like an accusation. Everyone listening knew that the outstanding work had been performed by the pilot they'd refused to authorize, flying the aircraft they deemed obsolete for the mission. Inside the base command center, no one looked up from their consoles. A captain clicked his pen twice, crossed out the red X beside Operation Desert Rescue on the whiteboard, and wrote nothing in its place. The successful mission would exist in the official record as an anomaly, a statistical correction that happened without explanation or attribution. One of the elite pilots who'd failed the morning's attempt stood by the tent exit with his helmet tucked under his arm, staring at the floor with the expression of someone reassessing everything he thought he knew about flying. Without a word. To his colleagues, he stepped outside and walked toward the flight line. He never returned to the command post that night. What they didn't know was that the rescue had been accomplished using techniques that challenged fundamental assumptions about aircraft capabilities and tactical operations. Isabella had just rewritten the book on combat rescue, unofficially and without recognition. The shift change happened quietly, completely. New controllers took over the radio frequencies, new officers assumed command responsibilities, and the failed mission that had consumed the base's attention for 14 hours simply became a successful extraction that no one wanted to discuss in detail. Out on the flight line, Isabella's A-10 sat near the center of the taxiway now, moved and reparked by ground crews who'd acted without specific orders. The aircraft was no longer hidden along the forgotten edges of the base. The hangar floodlights caught its weathered skin and gave it new dignity, the respect accorded to machines that delivered when it mattered most. No one approached the aircraft directly, but a mechanic walked past carrying a thermos of hot coffee. He set it down beside the wing without ceremony. No label, no note, just placed there with the careful attention of someone who understood. That some gestures spoke louder than words. The thermos sat there like a small monument to competence, waiting for the pilot who'd reminded everyone what flying was really about. But hidden underneath it was something else. A folded piece of paper with handwritten technical specifications for the modifications Isabella had made to her aircraft. Someone had been watching, learning, documenting. Isabella sat on the wing of her A-10, one leg draped over the edge, the other propped beneath her as she leaned against the fuselage. The metal was still warm from the day's heat, and the familiar feel of it against her back was more comforting than any debriefing room could have been. Her mission report was spread across her lap, not because anyone had requested it, but because that's what professional pilots did after missions that saved lives. She wrote slowly in black ink, using block letters that were precise and exact. Each entry matched the timestamp on her cracked stopwatch, creating a record that no one would read officially, but that would stand as proof of what had actually happened tonight. The base around her had transformed in subtle but unmistakable ways. The sharp tension that had defined the day had softened into something else, not quite reverence, but a careful watchfulness that suggested everyone was reassessing what they thought they knew about the quiet pilot and her modified aircraft. A junior airman crossed the tarmac carrying 2 clipboards, his usual route taking him past her aircraft. He paused, glanced around to see if anyone was watching, then quietly adjusted the daily flight manifest on his top sheet. Isabella's aircraft code appeared in the margin, written in careful handwriting that wouldn't pass official scrutiny, but would be there for anyone who looked closely enough. Near the operations tent, conversations had taken on a different tone. Voices lowered when she walked past, not from dismissal, but from something approaching respect. A discussion stopped mid-sentence as she approached, then resumed with more measured words and less casual arrogance. Someone had moved a stack of equipment crates to give her aircraft more clearance space. Unprompted, unordered, just done, because it seemed like the right thing to do. Another ground crew member nodded as she passed, unsure whether military protocol required a salute, but certain that some acknowledgement was appropriate. Inside the administrative trailer, Commander Patricia Hayes scanned the evening's dispatch. Summary. Her eye caught on an unmarked entry, Isabella's flight number written by hand in the margin of the official log. Hayes was a 25-year veteran who'd learned to read between the lines of military bureaucracy. She knew what the handwritten entry meant. Someone had completed a mission that officially never happened, using an aircraft that wasn't supposed to be capable of the work, succeeding where authorized crews had failed. But more than that, she recognized the technical innovation that had made the impossible mission possible. Hayes reached for her pen and signed the bottom of the dispatch page without comment or correction. The signature made the entire log official, including the marginalia that would ensure Isabella's flight existed in the permanent record. But she also made a note in her personal files, the kind of notation that would ensure certain modifications found their way into official research and development programs. Outside, the airstrip was quieter than it had been in weeks. The sharp edges of failure and frustration had dulled into something more contemplative. Personnel moved with less urgency, spoke with less volume, and carried themselves with the subdued energy of people who'd witnessed something that challenged their assumptions about how things were supposed to work. No one used Isabella's name in their conversations, but no one looked past her anymore either. She'd become visible not through self-promotion or political maneuvering, but through the simple act of delivering results when results seemed impossible. Isabella folded her handwritten mission report and tucked it into her leather bag. She slid off the wing with practiced ease, her boots landing in the dust with a soft thud that seemed to carry more weight than it should have. The thermos left by the anonymous mechanic sat beside the wing like an offering. She picked it up, turned it once in her hands to feel its warmth, then discovered the folded paper hidden beneath it. The technical specifications were detailed, accurate and unsigned, evidence that someone had been studying her modifications with professional interest. She smiled slightly as she read the notes. Someone understood what she'd accomplished. Someone was learning from her innovations. The knowledge wouldn't remain buried in unofficial channels forever. She carried both the thermos and the technical notes up to her cockpit, settling into the pilot seat that had carried her through another mission others couldn't complete. No one came to thank her directly. The mission had been unauthorized, after all, and official gratitude would raise uncomfortable questions about why authorization had been withheld in the first place. But she didn't need formal recognition to understand what had changed. She had been there when the base needed someone who could fly through impossible conditions. She had succeeded when their best and brightest had returned with excuses. She had demonstrated the difference between following procedures and saving lives. Most importantly, she had proven that innovation could triumph over convention, that thinking differently could accomplish what thinking traditionally couldn't. Now she sat alone in the aircraft that had carried her through another mission others couldn't complete. She was still the same woman they'd dismissed that morning, but she was no longer invisible. The transformation hadn't happened through politics or promotion, but through the kind of competence that spoke for itself when words weren't enough. Outside her aircraft, the base continued its evening routine with one significant difference. The quiet pilot with the modified A-10 was no longer someone to be overlooked. She was someone to be reckoned with. The change was subtle, but unmistakable. Respect earned through action rather than demanded through rank. Recognition that came not from what she said, but from what she delivered when delivery mattered most. And in the military culture that valued results above rhetoric, that kind of recognition was worth more than any medal or commendation that could be pinned to a uniform. It was the kind of respect that opened doors, changed policies, and ensured that innovative thinking would find its way into official doctrine. But most importantly, it was the beginning of something larger. A quiet revolution in how the military thought about aircraft capabilities, pilot training, and the value of unconventional approaches to impossible problems. 5 days after, the Mountain Rescue, a brief mention appeared in a regional military journal covering routine extraction operations. Buried in the middle of a longer piece about search and rescue innovations, a single sentence read, "An unconventional approach. Using modified aircraft successfully completed the extraction where 4 previous attempts had failed due to adverse conditions." No names were mentioned, no aircraft specifications detailed, just a clinical acknowledgement that someone had succeeded where others hadn't. Most readers would have skipped past it entirely, but one person didn't. Retired Air Force engineer Dr. Michael Torres was researching unconventional aircraft modifications when the phrase modified aircraft caught his attention. He pulled a collection of classified technical manuals from his personal archive and flipped to the section on low-altitude rescue procedures. There, in faded print, was a handwritten notation. Adjusted approach vector per IR field modification. Mountain terrain model. The initials IR appeared in several places throughout the manual, always beside calculations that seemed to anticipate problems the official procedures didn't address. Torres had seen similar annotations in other vintage technical materials. The kind of practical modifications that experienced pilots made when textbook solutions weren't enough. He scanned the pages and uploaded them to a military engineering forum, noting the gap between theoretical design and real-world application. The post would have disappeared into internet obscurity if not for what happened next. A classified training video began circulating among flight instructor networks, archived footage from a restricted military server that showed mountain terrain from a cockpit perspective. No faces appeared in the clip, no identifying information, but the voice narrating over the footage was steady and unmistakably competent. This is where you trust instinct over instruments. You're not flying through computer models or simulation parameters. You're flying through terrain that demands innovation, through conditions that require techniques that can't be programmed or simulated. People began asking questions about the voice. Someone with access to old training archives matched the audio to previous instructional recordings. Sessions from back when mountain rescue techniques were still taught without computer assistance. The name that appeared in the metadata wasn't listed on any current faculty roster or recent commendation list, but it was there. Isabella Riley. Flight instructor forums picked up the story, then advanced pilot training academies. Young aviators began mentioning her name the way extreme. Athletes talk about pioneers, with admiration edged by disbelief that anyone would attempt what she routinely accomplished. Flight schools across 4 different bases quietly added a new element to their mountain rescue training modules. They called it the Riley Protocol, a series of modifications that no one formally endorsed but that instructors began teaching. When standard procedures weren't sufficient for difficult terrain. A still photograph appeared on military aviation social media, a wide-angle shot of Isabella's aircraft on final approach to the mountain rescue zone, taken from base surveillance. Camera footage and uploaded anonymously. The plane's weathered silhouette and unconventional approach angle looked almost otherworldly against the storm-darkened peaks. Someone captioned it, "She flew it anyway." The phrase spread through the military aviation community like a coded acknowledgement of pilots who didn't wait for perfect conditions or complete authorization to accomplish necessary missions. It appeared on maintenance bay whiteboards, typed in small font on the corners of squadron patches, and scrolled in flight logbooks beside entries for aircraft that had exceeded their supposed limitations. No journalist ever interviewed Isabella about the mountain rescue mission. No official articles were written about her contribution. She didn't respond to the few requests that made their way through official channels, and she never appeared at any symposiums or training conferences. But the hangar where she maintained her aircraft began drawing quiet visitors. Military Academy cadets walked past more slowly during base tours. Veterans from old combat wings stood in the hangar's shadow with long silences that spoke of recognition and respect. There was no formal commemoration, no plaque or official designation, but people lingered. They came to see the aircraft that had succeeded when success seemed impossible, flown by the pilot who'd reminded everyone what innovation looked like when combined with experience and courage. A maintenance technician from the latest training. Rotation found an old technical manual tucked into a side cabinet near Isabella's workstation. The entries were handwritten in the same precise block letters she used for official reports, documenting hundreds of modifications that had never made headlines but had always delivered results. The signature at the bottom of each entry read, "I. Riley, mission complete." He didn't file the manual with base archives. Instead, he photographed several pages and posted them once on an engineering forum, then carefully placed the manual back exactly where he'd found it. The images circulated quietly among people who understood what they were looking at, a record of innovation that spoke louder than any research paper or patent application ever could. But Isabella herself remained elusive. She was spotted once more by a base commander during an early morning inspection, weeks after the mountain rescue mission. She wore the same faded flight suit, carried the same leather bag, and methodically checked the same engine components on her A-10 that she'd been checking for years. She left no note, spoke to no one, and by the time anyone thought to approach her for conversation, the aircraft had been transferred to a different section of the base. Her hangar space stood empty except for a small piece of white notepaper taped to the back wall near the electrical panel. In block print, someone had written, "Innovation doesn't ask permission when lives are on the line." The quote was misattributed to a training officer in the official rumor mill, but everyone who saw it knew exactly who it belonged to, and no one took it down. The note remained there long after Isabella Riley had moved on to whatever mission came next, a small monument to the pilot who'd proved that the most important flights often happen when no one thinks to grant clearance. For takeoff, the runway stretched empty in the desert morning, heat already beginning to shimmer off the tarmac despite the early hour. A faded windsock hung motionless from its mast, catching occasional gusts that made it snap with a sound that echoed off the distant hangars before fading into silence. Isabella's A-10 sat alone near the edge of the flight line, its weathered surface warmed by climbing sunlight. The aircraft looked older now, more deliberate in its stillness, but it had been meticulously maintained, cleaned, serviced, and prepared with the care reserved for machines that had proven their worth when it mattered most. The cargo bay was loaded with a single wooden crate, unmarked, secured with military precision, containing technical blueprints and modification specifications that would revolutionize military aviation. But officially, the crate didn't exist. She moved around the aircraft with quiet efficiency, checking hydraulic pressure with the thoroughness of someone who understood that small oversights could become large problems at altitude. She wiped accumulated sand from the engine intake filters and secured the mysterious crate in the cargo bay with the same meticulous attention she'd given to the rescue mission equipment. A canvas pack hung across one shoulder, heavier than usual, suggesting personal belongings rather than just mission equipment. Her flight suit showed the honest wear of someone who'd spent decades in cockpits rather than briefing rooms, the fabric sun-bleached at the seams and softened by countless flights into places other pilots wouldn't go. She paused near the wing, squinting into the desert wind that carried the scent of sage and aviation fuel. Then she reached up and pressed her palm once against the undercarriage of the aircraft. Not a ceremonial gesture, just the kind of physical connection that experienced pilots maintained with machines that had carried them safely through impossible situations. Across the flight line, a young pilot in a fresh uniform watched from beside the base operations building. Lieutenant Amanda Foster had graduated first in her flight training class 8 months ago, full of confidence in modern avionics and digital flight systems. But she'd been at the base the night of the mountain rescue mission, had seen the older pilot succeed where elite crews had failed. She didn't call out or wave. She simply stood still as Isabella climbed into her cockpit, recognizing that she was witnessing something significant. The departure of someone who'd redefined what competence looked like when stripped of rank and politics. Isabella paused in the cockpit, not to look back at the base that had finally learned to respect her abilities, but to activate one final piece of hidden equipment. A small transmitter that would broadcast her technical innovations to research facilities across the country, ensuring that her discoveries wouldn't disappear with her departure. Then the canopy closed with the solid thunk of well-maintained machinery. The aircraft sat motionless for several minutes, engines silent, while its pilot completed the kind of thorough pre-flight check that had become second nature over 2 decades of flying missions others couldn't handle. No tower communication crackled through the radio frequencies. No flight plan had been filed with base operations. When the engines finally came alive, they did so with the deep, even roar of mechanical systems that had been pushed to their limits, and had never failed to deliver. The A-10 rolled forward with the purposeful weight of an aircraft that knew exactly where it was going. No clearance was requested, no lights flashed from the control tower. But as the wheels left the tarmac and she lifted into the morning sky, steady and small against the pale blue vastness, a signal began transmitting from her aircraft, carrying technical specifications that would change military aviation forever. Lieutenant Foster watched until the aircraft disappeared into the heat shimmer on the horizon. She'd learned more about flying from watching Isabella Riley's unauthorized rescue mission than she had from her entire formal training program. The lesson wasn't about breaking rules or ignoring authority. It was about understanding that competence spoke louder than credentials, that results mattered more than recognition, and that the most important missions often happened when someone simply decided to act instead of waiting for permission. Back in the hangar that had housed Isabella's aircraft, the white note still clung to the wall. Innovation doesn't ask permission when lives are on the line. Maintenance crews worked around it without disturbing it, understanding that some messages were worth preserving. Isabella Riley had been overlooked, dismissed, and ignored throughout most of her career, not because she lacked skill, but because she'd never demanded to be seen. She'd never raised her voice, never argued her worth, never campaigned for recognition or promotion. Instead, she had simply prepared, innovated, and delivered when no one else could. She'd chosen precision over politics, competence over credentials, and mission accomplishment over personal advancement. In a world that often confused noise with substance, she demonstrated that quiet innovation could accomplish what loud confidence couldn't. Her strength had come not from being recognized by others, but from knowing exactly who she was when no one was watching. And now her innovations would live on in ways she'd never intended, inspiring a generation of pilots who understood that the most extraordinary achievements often happened far from spotlights and applause. The story of her unauthorized rescue mission would circulate for years among pilots who understood that flying wasn't just about following procedures, but about making decisions when procedures weren't enough. Young aviators would learn her name alongside the technical skills that kept aircraft in the sky, and some would remember that the most remarkable achievements often happened when someone decided to innovate rather than replicate. She'd proven that being underestimated could be an advantage, that competence needed no announcement, and that sometimes the quietest flight left the deepest impression on everyone watching from the ground. Somewhere beyond the desert horizon, Isabella Riley continued flying toward whatever mission came next, carrying with her the knowledge that she'd reminded an entire airbase what professionalism looked like when measured by results rather than recognition. And for those left behind, her example would serve as a quiet reminder that excellence didn't require an audience. It just required someone willing to innovate when innovation mattered most. If you enjoyed this story about Isabella Riley's incredible journey from overlooked pilot to legendary innovator, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. We share powerful tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when it matters most. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Have you ever been underestimated like Isabella? Share your own story of quiet courage in the comments.